The rain lashed against the leaded glass of the nursery like the fingers of something desperate, something that wanted in. It was the only sound in the suffocating silence of Penhaligon Hall, that and the soft, unknowing breath of a sleeping child. Amy stood at the cradle's edge, her white nightgown ghostly in the candlelight, her fingers trembling as she smoothed the wool blanket tucked beneath little Arthur's chin. The brass candelabra on the mantel burned between them, between her and the man who had followed her here, not out of tenderness, but out of something colder, something administrative. She had felt him enter before she heard him. 3 years of marriage had taught her the particular weight of Joseph Morris's silence. It was always a business arrangement, Amy. His voice was a blade, not the kind that screams through the air, but the kind that slides in slow, almost courteous. He did not look at her. He looked at the shadows pooling on the damask wallpaper, as though she were not worth the effort of his gaze. You provided the air. A pause, measured and deliberate. I provided the title. Do not mistake my presence for affection. The fire in the hearth chose that moment to die, not dramatically, not with a final burst of defiance, but quietly, the way hope dies when it has been patient too long. The embers exhaled once and went dark. I never loved you. I never will. He turned and left. The oak door closed behind him with a sound like a coffin being sealed, final, hollow, irreversible. Amy did not crumble. She had rehearsed crumbling 100 times in her mind across 3 years of careful smiles and silent dinners, and nights spent staring at a ceiling that had never once felt like home. She had spent so long bracing for the blow that when it finally landed, something unexpected happened. She became very, very still. She looked down at Arthur, his dark lashes fanned against round, flushed cheeks, his small fist curled loosely at his chin, blissfully unaware that his world had just been bisected by 7 words. He had his father's straight brow and proud jaw, but he had her eyes, that particular shade of quiet amber that people always underestimated. The eyes of someone who watched, who catalogued, who remembered. He has my eyes, she thought, and he will have my spine. The clock on the mantel ticked into the silence. Midnight. Then past it, Amy Arnold, Duchess of Penhaligon, placeholder, forgotten, pressed one last kiss to her son's brow. Then she straightened her back into something that would never curve with submission again. By the time the grey light of dawn crept over the moors and through the leaded glass, the Duke's chambers would be cold. The cradle would be empty, and the great Joseph Morris would discover that a man may own a title, an estate, and a dynasty, but he cannot own a woman who has finally decided to leave. She had already begun to plan. Joseph Morris, 4th Duke of Penhaligon, did not dream. He never had, or so he told himself. Dreaming required a softness of mind he had long ago decided was incompatible with the weight of a dukedom. Men like him did not drift into fantasy. They slept, they rose, they managed. That was the covenant he had made with himself at 17, standing at his father's graveside in the November frost, watching the Morris legacy get lowered into cold earth. So when he woke that morning to a silence so complete it pressed against his eardrums like a held breath, he didn't immediately understand that something was wrong. He lay still for a moment, staring at the canopy above his bed, his mind already cataloguing the day's obligations. A meeting with his solicitor, correspondence from the Northern estate, the quarterly ledgers that Hargreaves kept leaving pointedly on his desk, the usual machinery of his life ticking reliably forward. Then the silence registered, truly registered, and something primitive stirred at the base of his spine. Penhaligon Hall was never silent in the morning. There were always sounds, the distant clatter of the kitchen staff, the measured footsteps of the housemaids beginning their rounds, the occasional creak of the old house settling into the new day. And beneath all of it, threaded through the walls like a heartbeat, there was always, always, the small, insistent sounds of Arthur. A coo, a cry, a laugh that carried through 3 corridors and still managed to be, against all of Joseph's carefully maintained indifference, the clearest sound in the building. This morning there was nothing. He was on his feet before the thought had fully formed. The corridor outside the nursery was empty. The housemaid who stationed herself there each morning, a young woman whose name Joseph had never troubled himself to learn, was absent. The small chair she occupied was pushed neatly against the wall, as though someone had tidied after themselves with great deliberateness. Joseph pushed the nursery door open. The cradle was empty. He stood in the doorway for what felt like a very long time, staring at the small wool blanket that lay folded, not abandoned, not thrown aside in haste, but folded with quiet precision across the mattress. A single white ribbon sat on top of it. He recognized it as the one Amy habitually wore in her hair. She had left it deliberately. He understood that immediately, and the understanding was like stepping onto ice he hadn't known was thin. He crossed to the window. The grounds below were still, wet with last night's rain. The gravel of the carriage drive unmarked except for two parallel grooves, wheels, that curved away from the servants' entrance and disappeared beyond the gate. Someone had been methodical. Someone had arranged a carriage not from the main entrance, where the night footman would have seen, but from the east side of the property, where the old cartway ran along the edge of the wood. She planned this. The thought arrived with a quality he wasn't prepared for, not the flat surprise of a man whose property has been disturbed, but something sharper, something almost like vertigo. He found Mrs. Holloway, the housekeeper, in the kitchen corridor, her face arranged in an expression of such careful neutrality that it told him everything she was trying not to say. "When?" he said. "Not what happened, or where is she? Simply, when?" "Before 3, Your Grace." Mrs. Holloway's hands were folded at her waist, her eyes fixed at a point slightly above his shoulder. "I was not made aware until dawn, when Mary went to the nursery for the morning feed and found—" She stopped, steadied herself, found it as it is now. "And the staff. None saw her leave, Your Grace. Or so they say." The addendum was deliberate. He heard it clearly. "Or so they say." Meaning some of them had known, meaning Amy had cultivated, quietly and without his ever noticing, a loyalty in this house that ran beneath the surface of daily service like an underground river, invisible, patient, powerful. He thought of the way she moved through the hall, always pleasant, never demanding, learning every name he had never bothered to ask. He had observed it and filed it away as the inconsequential socializing of a woman with too little to occupy her mind. He was beginning to understand that he had misread nearly everything. He returned to the nursery alone. He was not certain why. There was nothing to be done there. No clue he hadn't already absorbed. No trace of her beyond the folded blanket and the ribbon. And yet he stood at the cradle's edge where Amy had stood just hours before, his hands loose at his sides, and looked down at the small indentation in the mattress where Arthur had slept. The boy was 11 months old. He had on one occasion grabbed Joseph's finger with a grip that was, Joseph had noted clinically, remarkably strong for an infant. On another occasion, he had looked up at his father from the cradle floor with an expression of such frank, uncomplicated delight that Joseph had left the room within the minute, disturbed in a way he could not then name. He could name it now, standing in the ringing silence of the empty nursery with the rain-washed morning light falling grey and cold through the window. It was the feeling of something being real. He had not wanted anything in this house to be real. He had constructed his marriage on the solid ground of transaction precisely to prevent it. And now the transaction had walked out of the servants' entrance before 3 in the morning, taking with it the only thing he had ever produced that was not simply an extension of duty. Joseph Morris stood at the empty cradle for a long time. Then he went to find Hargreaves and told him to hire the best investigator in England. The investigator's name was Callum Reed, a lean, weathered man with the unhurried manner of someone who had learned that patience was more reliable than urgency. He arrived at Penhaligon Hall by early afternoon, took one measured look at the Duke standing in the entrance hall, and said nothing beyond what was necessary. Joseph appreciated that immediately. They began with her rooms. Amy's private sitting room was at the east end of the hall, separated from the master chambers by a corridor and a deliberate distance that Joseph had never once questioned. He had assumed she preferred the quieter aspect. The window there faced the garden rather than the moors, and Amy had always seemed to prefer growing things to open sky. He pushed the door open now and stepped inside. The room was immaculate. That was the first thing, not ransacked, not emptied in panic, but composed with the same quiet precision as the folded blanket in the nursery. The furniture stood exactly as it always had. The embroidery frame sat beside the window, a half-finished pattern of winter roses still threaded through the linen, the needle resting as though she had simply stepped away for a moment and would return. It was the half that told the true story. Reed crouched before the fireplace, his forearms resting on his knees, and studied the grate without touching it. The ash was deep, far deeper than a single evening's fire warranted, and within it, if you looked with the right kind of attention, you could make out the ghost of edges, the curled black remains of pages, the stiffened corners of what had once been bound leather. "Journals," Reed said quietly. Not a question. She kept several. Joseph stood behind him, his voice entirely flat. She wrote daily, had done since before we married. Years of her inner life reduced to carbon and silence. She had burned them herself, that much was clear. The logs had been stacked carefully, the draft open to draw the heat upward efficiently. Even in destruction, Amy had been methodical. Joseph found he could not look away from the ash. It was Reed who found the first frame, or rather, the absence of it. He moved through the room with the systematic patience of a man reading a language others couldn't see, pausing at the small marks on the wallpaper where pictures had once hung, 5 of them along the east wall alone, pale rectangles where the paper had been protected from years of light, clean shapes against the faded ground, perfectly spaced. "What hung here?" Reed asked. Joseph looked at the marks and experienced something he could not immediately classify. Portraits, miniatures mostly, her mother, her sister in Bath. He paused, one of herself, painted the year before our marriage. And here, Reedy indicated the larger pale rectangle above the writing desk, a shape roughly 18 inches square. Joseph was quiet for a moment. Our wedding portrait, a study, not the formal commission. She had preferred it to the larger one. He had not known she preferred it. He had not known she preferred the garden view either, until he stood in her sitting room for what he now understood was the first time and began to read the small evidence of a life she had assembled entirely without him. Reed opened the writing desk. The cubbies and drawers were empty, not stripped carelessly, but cleared with purpose. Nothing left behind that bore her name or her hand. No letters, no receipts, no calling cards. Even the small personal seal she used for correspondence was gone. "She has removed every document that could be used to trace her movements," Reed said. "Correspondence, account records, anything that would indicate regular contacts or destinations." He closed the desk with quiet precision. "This was not impulse, Your Grace. This took time to arrange." "How much time?" Reed considered the room the way a physician considers a patient. Not coldly, but with a diagnostic remove that precluded sentiment. "Weeks, perhaps longer." Joseph walked to the window and looked out at the garden below. The winter roses Amy had planted along the south wall were bare now, thorned and skeletal in the grey morning. But he knew, because he had watched from a distance without understanding he was watching, that she had tended them every week without exception, even in November, even in the rain. He pressed 2 fingers to the cold glass. Weeks. She had been planning this while sitting across from him at dinner, while attending his mother's winter gathering, while standing in the nursery with Arthur on her hip, and that composed, pleasant expression she wore like armor. She had been building her exit the way she built everything, quietly, carefully, and entirely without his assistance. He had looked at this woman every day for 3 years and seen exactly what he had decided to see: a suitable wife, a capable duchess, an uncomplicated arrangement made flesh. He had not once looked at her as though she might be thinking. The realization did not arrive with drama. It settled over him the way dusk settles, gradually, and then all at once, and too late to do anything about the dark. Reed appeared at his shoulder. "There is one more thing, Your Grace." He led Joseph to the small dressing room adjacent. On the shelf above the empty vanity, arranged with almost theatrical precision, sat a single item that Amy had chosen not to burn, not to take, and not to hide. Their marriage certificate. Face down, the town of Carveth Cove did not appear on most maps. This was. Amy had decided when she first discovered it, 3 months prior, during one of her solitary carriage rides. Rides Joseph had never questioned, because he had never considered where she might go. Its single greatest virtue. It existed in the particular way that small coastal towns exist, stubbornly, saltily, and entirely indifferent to the concerns of the wider world. The kind of place where strangers were noted but not interrogated, where the rhythm of the tide organized the day more reliably than any clock, and where a quiet woman with an infant and a modest trunk could settle into a rented room above a draper's shop without generating more than a week's worth of careful curiosity. She had given her name as Anne Weir. It was close enough to her own that it would answer naturally when called across a market square. She had read enough cautionary tales to know that elaborate reinventions failed at precisely the moments they were needed most. Anne Ware was a widow from the north. Her husband had been a merchant, respectable but unremarkable, gone these past 8 months to a fever that had moved quickly. She had come south for the sea air, for the child's health, for a fresh beginning. It was a story with just enough texture to satisfy and just enough sorrow to discourage further questions. The people of Carveth Cove, she discovered, were fundamentally decent. They left her alone in the way that people leave alone someone they have correctly identified as having earned their solitude. She set up her workstation at the window of the upstairs room on her 4th morning, while Arthur slept in the travelling cot she had positioned against the inside wall, away from the draught. Angled toward the light, the window looked out over the harbour, where the fishing boats went out before dawn and returned smelling of brine and industry. And she had found almost immediately that the sight of purposeful movement, of people engaged in honest and uncomplicated work, steadied something in her that had been vibrating at a dangerous frequency since the night she left. Her embroidery kit occupied one corner of the small table. She had packed it before she packed anything else, before the documents she had spent weeks quietly accumulating, before Arthur's extra blankets, before the modest sum of money she had been setting aside in careful increments from her household allowance for the better part of a year. The kit had been her first thought and her surest instinct, because Amy Arnold had understood something about herself that Joseph had entirely failed to notice. Her hands were never idle, and idle hands, in her experience, led a woman back to feelings she could not afford. She threaded her needle and began. The draper whose shop occupied the ground floor was a compact, practical woman named Mrs. Bessel, somewhere in her late 50s, with the particular unsentimental warmth of someone who had raised children alone and emerged from the experience with her humor intact. She had let the upstairs room without ceremony, and had not asked a single question that wasn't strictly logistical. On the 5th day, she knocked on Amy's door with a pot of tea and a direct expression. "I've had 3 customers ask about the piece in your window," she said, nodding toward the small framed sample Amy had hung at the glass, a panel of winter botanicals worked in cream and pale blue silk that she had completed in 2 evenings. "The magistrate's wife wants to know if you take commissions." Amy looked at her steadily. "What did you tell her?" "I told her I'd inquire." Mrs. Bessel set the tea down and looked at the workstation with the assessing eye of a woman who understood the value of a skilled pair of hands. "Can you do interiors? Furnishing panels, fire screens, that sort of work?" "Yes." "Quickly. When required?" Mrs. Bessel nodded once, as though a decision had been confirmed rather than made. "I'll send." Mrs. Bessel nodded once. "Carol up tomorrow morning. You'll want to set a fair price and not apologize for it. Women in this town have a habit of undervaluing their work and then resenting everyone for it." She left without further elaboration, and Amy sat for a moment looking at the closed door with something that felt, cautiously, like the earliest possible form of gratitude. The magistrate's wife became the alderman's wife. The alderman's wife became the rector's daughter, who was to be married in the spring, and wanted something extraordinary for the wedding panel. Word moved through Carveth Cove the way all meaningful information moves through small places. Not announced, but understood. Passed between women over garden walls, and in the back pews of churches and across market stalls, with the quiet efficiency of a network that had always existed and simply awaited the right addition. Within 6 weeks, Anne Ware had a order book, a waiting list, and a reputation for work that was, as Mrs. Carrow had told the rector's wife, unlike anything produced by the usual commercial houses. Amy had known it would happen. She had always known what her hands were capable of. It was simply that at Penhaligon Hall no one had ever thought to ask. In the evenings, after Arthur had been settled and the harbour lights came on, one by one across the dark water, she would sit at her window with the last of the day's thread and allow herself, very briefly, to feel the full weight of what she had done. Not with regret. She had examined regret carefully and found it had no legitimate claim on her, but with a sober, clear-eyed acknowledgement that she had dismantled one life entirely and was building another from its most essential materials. Her skill, her son, her name, her chosen name, the one that fit her better now than the one she had been given at the altar. Anne Ware worked by lamplight, and the stitches were very fine, and outside the sea moved the way it always had, indifferent to dukes, indifferent to titles, answering to nothing but the pull of something vast and patient, and entirely its own. She found she had a great deal in common with the sea. Reade delivered his first report on a Thursday, 14 days after Amy had vanished. It contained very little. A carriage traced as far as the market town of Aldwick, where the trail dissolved into the ordinary commerce of a busy coaching inn. 3 departures logged that morning, none with a passenger matching Amy's description precisely, all heading in different directions. A name inquired after at 2 posting houses, yielding nothing. A rumour, sourced from a stable hand who may or may not have been reliable, of a woman with an infant who had paid for passage in coin rather than by account. Joseph read it twice, set it on his desk, and stared at it for a long time. The woman who had paid in coin was the same woman who had managed his household accounts for 3 years, with the precision his own secretary had privately admired. The woman who had left no traceable name was the same woman who had attended every social obligation of the duchy, without a single misstep of protocol or propriety. He had credited those qualities to good breeding, to the careful instruction of her modest but respectable upbringing. It had not occurred to him, not once, that they might instead be evidence of an exceptionally organized mind. He told Reade to hire 2 additional men and expand the search south. It was his mother who first said what the household had been carefully not saying. The Dowager Duchess arrived on the 15th day in a state of magnificent, controlled displeasure. Travelling coat still on, gloves not yet removed. The particular expression she reserved for situations she considered beneath the dignity of the family, and yet somehow attributable to her son's failures of judgment. She stood in the centre of Joseph's study, looked at the maps spread across his desk, the stacked investigators' reports, the half-consumed decanter of brandy that had taken up permanent residence beside the inkwell, and said, "You drove her out." "I stated a truth," Joseph said. She chose her response. "You stated a cruelty and dressed it in the language of honesty." His mother removed her gloves with the methodical composure of someone making a point through every movement. "There is a distinction, Joseph, and the fact that you cannot locate it explains a great deal about the current state of your nursery." He said nothing. The Dowager settled herself into the chair across from his desk with the authority of someone who had occupied difficult rooms for 40 years and found them all manageable. "Tell me," she said, "what you actually knew about her." The question was so simply constructed that it took him a moment to understand it was not simple at all. He began to answer, and stopped. He had known she was the second daughter of Lord Arnold of Keswick, that her family's finances had made the match advantageous to both parties, that she was considered handsome and well-mannered, that she did not make demands or scenes. He had known the inventory of her qualities the way one knows the inventory of a well-appointed room, noting what was present, never troubling to wonder about what was not. "I knew what she was suited to," he said finally. His mother looked at him with an expression that belonged somewhere between pity and exhaustion. "You knew what you had decided to use her for. That is not the same thing." She rose, smoothing her skirts with the finality of someone closing a book. "Find her, Joseph, but understand something before you do. You are not looking for a runaway wife. You are looking for a woman you never had the courtesy to meet." She left him with that, and the brandy, and the maps. He began in the days that followed to look. Not for Amy. Reed and his men were occupied with that. Joseph began, in the privacy of his study and the longer privacy of his sleepless nights, to look at what she had left behind. Not the ash, not the empty frames, those he had examined already with the cold efficiency of investigation. He began instead to look at the house itself, through the new and uncomfortable lens of someone trying to understand rather than catalogue. He spoke to the staff. This was, in itself, an unusual enough event that it produced a visible unease among the senior household members who were accustomed to managing his needs without requiring his direct attention. He spoke to them regardless, and what emerged from those conversations, piece by careful piece, was a portrait of a woman he did not recognize. Amy had known the name of every person under this roof, not merely the senior staff, every person. The kitchen girl who was saving money to bring her younger brother south, the elderly groundskeeper whose rheumatism worsened in the east wind, for whom she had quietly arranged a less exposed set of duties without ever mentioning it to Joseph, the housemaid, the one whose name Joseph had never learned, whose mother had been ill last winter, and to whom Amy had given, from her own allowance, enough to cover the physician's fees. Joseph sat with these revelations the way one sits with a diagnosis, very still and trying to establish what exactly they changed. She had been building a life inside his house, a real one, textured and generous, and quietly radical in its attention to the people around her. She had done it entirely without his participation, and he had walked through the center of it every day for 3 years, looking at his ledgers, his obligations, his carefully maintained emotional distances, seeing nothing. He pulled a fresh sheet of paper toward him. At the top he wrote a single question, not for Reed, not for the investigators, but for himself, because the dowager had been correct. And the only honest thing left to do was to admit it plainly and in his own hand. Who was she? He stared at the words for a long time. Then he set down the pen, pressed his fingers to his eyes, and did something he had not done since he was 17 years old, standing at his father's grave in the November frost. He did not have an answer. Reedy's third man was named Pollard, and it was Pollard, the least distinguished of the three, a forgettable man with a forgettable face, which was precisely his professional advantage, who found the thread. A coaching inn outside Aldwych, a hostler who remembered, after sufficient encouragement, a woman with dark hair and an infant who had transferred to a private conveyance heading southwest. Not a hired carriage, a private arrangement paid in advance, the driver a local man who made occasional runs to the coastal towns for the right fee and the right discretion. The driver, when located, confirmed he had taken a woman as far as a junction 6 miles inland from the coast. He did not know which town she had ultimately reached. He had not asked, and she had not volunteered. But southwest meant the coast. And the coast, Reed noted in his report, narrowed the possibilities considerably. Joseph was in the carriage before the ink was dry. He arrived in Carverth Cove on a Tuesday, which was market day, which was, though he did not know it yet, both the worst possible timing and the most inevitable kind of coincidence. The town arranged itself around a central square on Tuesdays, the stalls running from the harbour front up through the narrow main street in a dense and cheerful press of commerce, fish and salt, bread and preserved goods, cloth from the inland mills, and along the upper row, the smaller trade of handmade things, lace, pottery, worked leather, and at the far end of the row, beneath a green canvas awning that snapped pleasantly in the sea wind, embroidered goods of a quality that had been drawing customers from 3 towns along the coast for the better part of 6 weeks. Joseph didn't see the store. He was moving through the square with Reed at his shoulder, methodical and grim, scanning faces with the focused attention of a man who had spent 7 weeks learning what focused attention actually required. He had memorized Amy as she was: dark hair, quiet amber eyes, a particular way of holding herself that was neither proud nor diminished, but something more difficult to name: present, contained, as though she occupied exactly the space she had decided to occupy and not an inch more. He was looking for that quality more than any feature. He found it. She was at the cloth merchant's stall, 2 rows across and perhaps 30 feet away, examining a bolt of deep green linen with the concentrated assessment of someone who understood material. Arthur was on her hip, one small fist buried in the dark hair at her neck, his attention fixed on the colored ribbons displayed at the stall's edge, with the absolute democratic fascination of a child for whom the entire world is equally astonishing. She looked different. Not unrecognizably so, but differently. She was dressed plainly and well, in clothes she had clearly chosen rather than been presented with, and her hair was arranged without the elaborate structure that Penhaligon's expectations had demanded. She looked, Joseph thought, with a shock that went somewhere below his sternum, like herself, as though the woman he had watched move through his house for 3 years had been a careful reproduction, and this woman turning the linen in the coastal light, tilting her head with a small private assessment, was the original. He had stopped walking without knowing he'd stopped. Reed, half a step behind, said very quietly, "Your Grace." It was the sound of his own title that moved her, not his presence. She hadn't seen him yet, but the formality of the address, the register of it, foreign and sharp in this particular square on this particular Tuesday morning. Her chin lifted. Her eyes swept the crowd with the swift, animal alertness of someone who had been expecting, at some level, this exact moment since the night she left. She found him immediately. For 3 full seconds neither of them moved. 30 feet of market day between them. The noise and movement of ordinary commerce. A child turning ribbons in his fist. The smell of brine and bread. The green canvas awning snapping overhead. And across all of it, a look that carried the full, unmediated weight of 7 weeks and 3 years, and every word that had been said, and every word that had not. Joseph saw her calculate. He watched it happen in the space of a heartbeat, her eyes moving from him to Reed, registering the investigator with the accuracy of someone who had anticipated exactly this configuration of threat. He watched her make a decision. Then she turned, tucking Arthur firmly against her hip, and walked, not ran, walked, with the composed and deliberate pace of someone who understood that panic is visible, and visibility is fatal, into the press of the crowd. Joseph moved forward. Amy. But the market swallowed her whole. The crowd closed around the space she had occupied with the indifferent efficiency of water filling a displaced space, and by the time Joseph reached the cloth merchant's stall, there was nothing, no sight of her, no sound of her, no trail beyond a bolt of green linen left half unrolled on the counter. The cloth merchant looked at him with the careful blankness of a man who has decided in the last 30 seconds not to have seen anything. Reed appeared at his shoulder. "She knows this town," he said. "She has people here." Joseph looked at the crowd. The closed, unrevealing faces of a small community that had made, apparently and without his knowledge, a collective decision about where its loyalties resided. The woman at the embroidered goods stall, he noticed now, had also disappeared. He thought of Mrs. Holloway's careful phrasing, or so they say, and understood that Amy had not merely run. She had built in each place she occupied the same invisible architecture of human connection that she had quietly constructed inside his own house. She had done it deliberately, and she had done it well, and the distance between them had not closed tonight. It had changed in character entirely. He was no longer hunting an absence. He was hunting a woman who was, in every practical sense, more capable than he had ever allowed himself to see. The realization did not make him stop, but it made him feel, for the first time, something that was not simply the wounded pride of a man whose property had removed itself. It made him feel, distantly and uncomfortably, something closer to respect. Joseph returned to Penhaligon Hall the following morning and went directly to his solicitor. He did not sleep on the journey. He sat in the darkened carriage with the coastal wind, finding the gaps in the window sills, and thought about the look on her face in the market square, not the fear, which had been brief and quickly mastered, but what had come immediately after it, the calculation, the pivot, the absolute absence of hesitation. He had spent 7 weeks imagining Amy as a fugitive, frightened, diminishing, running on the reserves of a desperate impulse. What he had seen in Carveth Cove's market square was something else entirely. A woman mid-stride in a life she had constructed with intention and was not prepared to surrender. He told himself that what he did next was a matter of legal necessity, that a man in his position had obligations to his title and his heir that superseded personal feeling, that the law was simply a tool and he was simply using it. He told himself these things with the fluency of a man who has had a great deal of practice believing what is convenient, and he instructed his solicitor to locate and freeze every financial instrument Amy had established outside of the household accounts. It took 11 days. Amy had been careful, more careful than his solicitor had initially credited, but the law in such matters was comprehensive, and the Morris name carried a weight that opened doors more reliably than any key. A small account held under a variant of her maiden name at a private bank in the nearest city, frozen. A secondary arrangement she had made through a solicitor in Aldwick, the details of which spoke to a forward planning so methodical it made Joseph's own man visibly uncomfortable, frozen. The quarter's earnings from the embroidery commissions, held pending collection at a postal address in the coastal district, intercepted when the letters reached her, and they were formal legal letters, drafted in the precise and bloodless language of institutional power. Amy sat at her window above the draper's shop and read them twice through, and then set them face down on the table beside her embroidery frame. Arthur was on the floor, engaged in the complex architectural project of stacking wooden spools that Mrs. Bessel had given him, frowning with great seriousness each time they toppled. He looked up at his mother once, with the instinctive animal sensitivity of young children, to shifts in atmospheric pressure, and she gave him a smile of such practiced steadiness that he returned, satisfied, to his spools. When he was not looking, she pressed the back of her hand to her mouth and breathed. She had planned for this. She had told herself she had planned for this. She had set aside reserves, had structured the accounts with exactly this eventuality in mind. A husband with legal authority, a legal system that treated married women's assets as provisional at best. She had studied the relevant statutes with the focused attention she had given to everything in the 18 months before she left, seated in the ducal library at odd hours, reading the dry language of property law with the grim thoroughness of someone arming herself. But the reserve account was smaller than it should have been. She had moved too quickly in the end. The night of their anniversary had accelerated a timeline she had needed another 4 months to complete, and what remained, once the frozen instruments were subtracted, was enough for perhaps 6 weeks at the current rate of modest living. After that, she would be dependent entirely on new commissions, on goodwill, on the slender and unreliable margin between self-sufficiency and need. And new commissions required a name, a traceable name. A name that could now, she understood, be used as a thread to find her. She sat with this for one evening, and one only, because she had learned by now that more than one evening given to fear was an indulgence she could not afford. Then she went downstairs to speak to Mrs. Bessel. The older woman listened without interruption, her hands folded on the counter of her closed shop, her expression giving away nothing beyond the quality of attention she brought to everything she considered important. Amy did not tell her everything. She told her enough: a husband with resources, a legal entanglement, a need to restructure how her commissions were received and recorded. Mrs. Missieved. Bessel was quiet for a long moment after she finished. "The magistrate's wife," she said finally, "Mrs. Carrow, she handles her own household accounts independently of her husband, has done for 20 years. A pause. She is also, as it happens, not fond of men who use institutional power as a substitute for personal reckoning. I believe the two of you would find a great deal of common ground." Amy looked at her steadily. "You would do this?" "I am doing it, Mrs. Bessel said, with the mild precision of someone correcting a grammatical error. The commission payments will be received through Mrs. Caro's household account and passed to you directly. It is a perfectly legal arrangement between two private individuals and none of anyone else's business. She picked up her keys from the counter, signaling the conversation's conclusion with the economy of a woman for whom decisions, once made, required no further ceremony. Amy climbed back to her room, settled Arthur into his cot, and returned to her embroidery frame. Her hands were steady. She made sure of it, pressed them flat against the table for 3 measured breaths, feeling the solidity of the wood, the small vibration of Arthur's sleeping weight through the floor, the distant rhythmic pull of the tide. Joseph had used his power to remind her of her vulnerability. She understood the move precisely, not as cruelty for its own sake, but as strategy, an attempt to reduce her options until only one remained: return. He was trying to starve her back into the life she had left. What he had miscalculated, what she was beginning to understand he had always miscalculated, was the quality of the world she had built around herself while he was not paying attention. He had frozen her accounts. He had not frozen her relationships, her reputation, her skill, or the quiet, solid loyalty of women who recognized in her situation the precise outlines of their own. She threaded her needle and bent to the frame. He was trying to reduce her to a name on a legal document. She was becoming, stitch by patient stitch, something considerably more difficult to contain. The storm came in from the west on a Friday evening, the kind that the coastal locals read 3 hours in advance from the color of the horizon and the behavior of the birds. Mrs. Bessel had moved Amy and Arthur to the stone cottage at the edge of her sister's property 2 weeks prior, a precaution after a stranger had been seen asking questions at the posting house. The cottage was small, solid, and set back from the coastal path behind a stand of wind-bent hawthorn that made it invisible from the road until you were nearly upon it. Reed found it anyway. Amy heard the carriage on the track at the same moment the storm broke properly overhead, the rain arriving, not gradually but all at once, as though a decision had been made. She was at the hearth with Arthur asleep in the back room, the embroidery frame untouched on the table, a cup of tea gone cold at her elbow. She had been sitting in the particular stillness of someone whose instincts had been speaking quietly for several days and have finally begun to speak at volume. She did not move when the knock came. She set down her cup, smoothed her skirts, and opened the door. Joseph stood in the rain without a hat, which struck her absurdly as the most human she had ever seen him. His coat was dark with water, his hair flattened against his forehead, and he looked, not as she had expected him to look. She had prepared herself for the version of Joseph she knew best, contained, authoritative, the Duke fully assembled and deployed. The man on her threshold was something rawer than that, something that had been traveling hard for a long time and had arrived before it had finished deciding what it meant to say. Reed was a shape in the darkness behind him. Joseph turned and said something brief and low, and Reed withdrew to the carriage without argument. "Amy," Joseph said. "Anne," she replied, not combatively, simply as a statement of fact, the way one corrects a name that has been genuinely forgotten. She stepped back from the door because he was soaked through and the storm was worsening, and whatever she felt about him, she was not prepared to feel it with the rain driving sideways between them. He came inside. She did not offer him tea. He looked around the cottage with the careful reading attention she recognized from the early days of their marriage, when she had still believed that attention was a form of interest rather than assessment. The single room, the modest furnishings, the embroidery frame with its half-finished panel of sea-colored silk, the small pair of boots near the hearth, absurdly tiny, that belonged to their son. His eyes stopped on the boots and stayed there for a moment too long. "He is well?" The question came out differently than he had perhaps intended, not as the opening of a negotiation, but as something more unguarded than that. "He is well," Amy said. "He has 4 new teeth and has learned to climb stairs, which is its own particular emergency. He is happy." She let the last words stand alone in the room, neither as cruelty nor as comfort, simply as information. Joseph turned to face her fully. "I want my son returned to Penhaligon. I know. You have no legal ground to. I know the law, Joseph." Her voice was quiet and entirely level. The voice she had spent 3 years perfecting in rooms where she was not permitted to be angry. I have known it considerably longer than you have known, I know it. Sit down or don't. But do not explain my situation to me as though I have not been living inside it. He sat. It was the sitting that undid the shape of the conversation she had been prepared to have. She had rehearsed a version of this confrontation, in the dark after Arthur slept, in the hollow middle hours of sleepless nights, in which Joseph was architecture, immovable, institutional, the full weight of his name and his sex and his legal authority arranged against her. She had built her arguments to withstand that version. The man sitting in the chair by her hearth, rain-soaked and not quite able to stop looking at the small boots, was not architecture. He was something more inconvenient than that. "I am not asking you to return as my Duchess," he said. The words came out with the particular difficulty of something that has been prepared, and then is not, in the moment of delivery, quite right. "I am asking you to bring Arthur home." "This is his home," Amy said. "He does not know Penhaligon. He knows this room, and Mrs. Bessel's cat, and the sound of the harbour in the morning. He knows me." A pause, measured and deliberate. "He is beginning to know himself. I will not take that from him to satisfy a legacy he did not ask to inherit. He is the Morris heir. He is a child." She met his eyes without flinching. "He is 11 months old, and he is mine, Joseph, in every way that the word has actual meaning. You provided the biological fact of him. I have provided everything since." The fire shifted in the hearth. Outside, the storm pressed against the cottage walls with a steady, indifferent force. "What do you want?" Joseph asked. The question was stripped of its usual architecture. No title in it, no strategy, just the question, plain and tired and more honest than anything he had said to her in 3 years of marriage. Amy had waited a long time to hear him ask it in exactly that register. "I want what I have already taken," she said. "My freedom, my son, my name. The one I have chosen, not the one I was assigned. I want to raise Arthur in a home where he learns that people are more than their utility to each other." She held his gaze. "I want him to be better than we were." The last sentence landed in the room and stayed. Joseph said nothing. The rain said everything else. The fire had burned down to a steady, low pulse by the time Amy rose from her chair. Joseph watched her cross to the small writing desk in the corner of the cottage. The same deliberate, unhurried movement he had observed in the market square, in the memory of everyone who had described her to him over 9 weeks of investigation. She opened the lower drawer and removed a document wallet, worn at the corners from handling, tied with a length of plain brown ribbon. She set it on the table between them without drama, without preamble, the way one sets down something that has been carried a long time and is ready to be put somewhere permanent. Then she sat, folded her hands in her lap, and looked at him. "Before I left," she said, "I spent 18 months reading everything in the Penhaligon library that was not meant for me." Joseph looked at the wallet. Something at the base of his spine had gone very still. "The restricted correspondence cabinet in your study," Amy continued, her voice carrying the same level quality it had held throughout the evening, not cold, not triumphant, but precise. "The one you believed was locked. The key is kept on the same ring as the wine cellar, which Mrs. Prare, Holloway, trusted me with in my first month as your Duchess, because someone had to manage the household and you had made it comprehensively clear that someone would not be you." He did not reach for the wallet immediately. He was not certain he was ready to know what was in it, and he had learned enough in the past 9 weeks to understand that certainty in dealings with Amy Arnold was a luxury that required earning. "What did you find?" he asked. She untied the ribbon herself and opened the wallet, removing the documents with the care of someone who understood their weight. She did not hand them to him. She laid them on the table in a sequence, with the quiet methodology of a solicitor presenting a case, and let him read. He leaned forward. The first document was a letter, dated 16 years prior, written in his father's hand, that distinctive, pressured script Joseph would have recognized in his sleep, and addressed to a man named Gerald Ashworth, who had been, Joseph knew, his father's closest associate and the former trustee of the Morris estate accounts. The letter detailed, in the careful language of men who understand that certain things must be said but not said plainly, An arrangement, a sum of money transferred from the estate accounts in the year of Joseph's mother's illness, redirected not to her physicians, as the household records of that year indicated, but to the settlement of a private debt, a debt incurred through a series of speculative investments that had failed catastrophically and had been, subsequently, concealed from the estate ledgers entirely. Joseph read it twice. Then he read the second document, Ashworth's reply, confirmatory and precise, and the third, which was a subsequent accounting that showed the full scale of what his father had quietly dismantled and then rebuilt on paper to look like something it had never been. The fourth Morris Duke had been beneath the impeccable surface of his reputation, a man who had spent the last decade of his life managing the concealed consequences of his own significant failures, and he had done it. Joseph understood as he sat in the rain-soaked cottage with the fire low and the storm overhead, by drawing on funds that were not entirely his to draw on, including portions of the estate endowment that had been legally held in trust for the Morris heir. For Joseph himself, he sat back in his chair. "There is more," Amy said, not unkindly. The Ashworth arrangement was not isolated. It was the largest, but there were others, smaller adjustments, redirected rents. A property in the northern district sold without being recorded in the primary ledger. I have a full accounting. She paused. I had it verified before I left by a solicitor in Edinburgh who has no connection to the Morris name or interests. The documentation is complete. Joseph looked at her across the low table, across the spread of papers that constituted the secret infrastructure of a legacy he had spent his entire adult life maintaining and defending and shaping himself to serve, and he experienced something he could not immediately name, a complex architectural collapse, something that had been load-bearing giving way quietly all at once. "You could have used this," he said, "before. You could have used it against me at any point." "Yes. Why didn't you?" Amy was quiet for a moment. Outside, the storm shifted register, the rain easing slightly, the wind finding a lower, steadier note, as though the worst of it had passed, and what remained was simply weather. "Because I am not interested in destroying you," she said. "I am interested in being free of you. Those are not the same objective, and I have always known the difference, even when you did not extend me the same distinction." She gathered the documents with careful hands and returned them to the wallet. "This is not a weapon, Joseph. It is a key. It equalizes us. It means that the legal instruments you used to freeze my accounts, the institutional weight of your name that you deployed against a woman with an infant and 6 weeks of reserves, cannot be used again, not without consequence that extends considerably beyond me." She tied the ribbon and set the wallet aside. "I am telling you this not to threaten you," she said, "but because I am tired of this being an unequal conversation. You have never spoken to me as an equal. I am requiring it now." The silence that followed was of a different quality than the silences that had preceded it. Not the silence of a man managing his response, not the silence of institutional authority composing itself, but something more exposed than either. Joseph sat in it without filling it, which was, Amy thought, perhaps the first genuinely honest thing he had done in her presence. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost the last of its formal register. "My father," he said, and then stopped, because the sentence had nowhere comfortable to go. He had spent 20 years curating the memory of the fourth Duke of Penhaligon into something worth inheriting, worth becoming, worth the cost of every personal feeling he had set aside in service of the continuation. The papers on the table did not destroy that entirely, but they cracked it in a specific and irreparable place, and through the crack came something cold and clarifying. His father had been a man, flawed, frightened, capable of significant failure and significant concealment, not a monument, not a covenant, a man. And Joseph had made himself in his father's image so completely that he had not noticed until a woman in a stone cottage by the sea laid the evidence quietly on a table between them, that the image had never been accurate. "You knew this," he said. "You knew this and you stayed. I stayed because I had made a promise." Amy said, "I left because you made it impossible to keep it honestly." She looked at him with the amber eyes he had failed for 3 years to read correctly. "I do not hate you, Joseph. I want you to understand that clearly. But I will not be managed by you, not by your affection, if you ever locate it, and certainly not by your power." The fire exhaled softly in the hearth. Outside, the storm was passing. The sea, patient and indifferent as ever, continued its long conversation with the shore. He did not leave that night. Not because Amy invited him to stay, she did not, but because the storm had made the coastal track impassable for a carriage, and because Reed, with the pragmatic efficiency that made him valuable, had already arranged a lamp and a blanket in the vehicle for himself, and sent word through the cottage door that the road would be manageable by first light. Joseph sat in the chair by the hearth as the fire rebuilt itself from embers, and Amy sat across from him, and for the first time in the entire history of their acquaintance, they occupied the same room without either of them performing anything at all. It was, Joseph thought, the most honest they had ever been in proximity to one another. After a long while, Amy rose and checked on Arthur. She left the back room door slightly open on her return, and in the new quiet of the past storm Joseph could hear the child's breathing, that small, unconscious, entirely trustful sound, moving in and out of the firelit air like something that had decided, without consulting anyone, to be the most important thing in the room. He listened to it for a long time before he spoke. "I have been thinking," he said, "about the night of our anniversary." Amy, who had taken up her embroidery not as an evasion, but as the thing her hands required when her mind was working, did not look up. "I assumed you would eventually. I have been trying to understand why I said what I said in the way that I said it." He paused. The sentence was more difficult than its construction suggested. Not to excuse it. I have spent enough weeks with my own company to understand that it is not excusable, but to locate it accurately. She set down the embroidery frame then and looked at him with the full reading attention he had spent 3 years failing to return. "And have you," she asked, "located it?" Joseph looked at the fire. He had rehearsed versions of this, in carriages, in the sleepless geometry of inn ceilings, in the study at Penhaligon, where the question he had written on a sheet of paper still sat, unanswered, on the desk. He had constructed arguments and discarded them because they were, on examination, defenses dressed as explanations. He was very tired of defenses. "My father," he said, "taught me that attachment was a liability. Not in words. He was too careful for direct instruction, but in the way he managed everything he valued, at a distance, through intermediaries, through structure and arrangement, so that nothing he cared about could be taken from him without warning." He stopped. "I watched him lose my mother's health to a winter he couldn't control, and I watched what it did to him, the panic underneath the composure, the thing he could not manage because he had never built the capacity to manage it, and I decided at 17 that I would not be made that vulnerable by anyone." The fire said nothing. The child's breathing continued its patient rhythm from the back room. "So you built a marriage," Amy said quietly, "designed to make sure you would never have to feel that." "Yes, and then you felt it anyway." The words arrived without cruelty, simply as the accurate conclusion to the logic he had laid out, and they landed with the particular precision of a thing that is true and has been true for some time, and is only now being said in a room where both people can hear it. Joseph did not answer immediately. He was locating something. The honest word for what had happened to him across 9 weeks of carriages and investigators and mentee nurseries and market squares and coastal storms. The thing that had been growing in the gap where his certainty used to be. "I could not breathe," he said finally. "When I woke to the silence, it was not the air, it was not the title, it was not the legal consequence or the scandal. It was—" He stopped again, started differently. "It was the boots, Amy, by the hearth tonight. Her small, ridiculous boots. I looked at them and I could not—" He pressed his hand briefly to his jaw, a gesture she had never seen from him. "I did not know it was possible to be undone by a pair of boots." Amy looked at him for a long time. The man in the chair was not the Duke of Penhaligon. He was a person, specific, frightened, shaped by a father's damage into careful armor that had served him faithfully right up until the moment it had cost him everything that mattered. She recognized the shape of that. She had worn her own version of it for 3 years. She did not love him. She was honest enough with herself to hold that clearly. Whatever she had felt at the beginning had been transformed by 3 years of being unseen into something more complicated and less simple than love. But she did not hate him either, and she had meant what she said the night before. Destruction had never been her objective. She thought of Arthur in the back room, asleep with his fist at his chin and his father's brow and her own eyes, growing daily into a person who would need, if she was doing her job correctly, to understand that people were capable of change, that damage was not destiny, that a man could be wrong for a long time and still, if he did the necessary work honestly, become something better. She thought of what it would mean to deny Arthur the living proof of that. "I will not return to Penhaligon," she said, "not as your duchess, not as your wife, not in any arrangement that requires me to subordinate what I have built here to what you need there. I want you to hear that as a permanent answer, not an opening position." Joseph nodded. Something in his posture had changed. The last of its formal architecture had gone, and what remained was simply a man sitting by a fire, listening. "But Arthur knows your eyes," Amy continued. "He carries them, and he will have questions eventually that I cannot answer for you. Questions about who he is and where he comes from and what kind of man his father chose to become." She paused, letting the word chose settle where she intended it. "I am not willing to answer those questions on your behalf. That is your work, if you are willing to do it." "What would that require?" Joseph asked. "Consistency," she said. "Not your title, not your money, not the legal weight of your name deployed as a substitute for presence. Presence itself. Letters when you cannot come. Visits when you cannot. The slow, unremarkable, unglamorous work of being known to a child over time." She met his eyes. "And if you ever, in word or action or legal instrument, attempt to use your power against me again, against my livelihood, my name, my freedom, my network of people who have chosen to stand with me, I will use every document in that wallet and every contact I have made in the past 9 weeks, and you will discover that I am considerably more formidable than the woman you dismissed in the nursery." It was not a threat. It was a fact, stated with the same levelness she brought to everything, and he received it as such. "I understand," Joseph said. "I need you to mean that. I know." He looked at the door to the back room, where Arthur's breathing moved quietly in and out of the fire-lit air. "I am beginning to understand a great many things I should have understood considerably earlier." They sat in silence after that, but it was a silence of a different kind than any they had shared before. Not the silence of avoidance or the silence of performance, but the silence of two people who have said what needed saying and are now simply present in the same room, in the same difficulty, trying to locate the shape of what comes next. Before the light changed toward dawn, Amy made tea. She set a cup in front of him without comment, and he accepted it without comment, and the ordinary human transaction of it was perhaps the closest thing to tenderness they had ever exchanged. When Reed knocked at first light to say the road was clear, Joseph rose and put on his still damp coat. He paused at the door. "The boots," he said. "When he is walking steadily, I would like to see that." Amy looked at him. "He is almost there," she said. "Another few weeks." Joseph nodded. He went out into the pale coastal morning, where the storm had washed everything to a clarity that was almost brutal, and did not look back. Not because he felt nothing, but because he was learning, slowly and too late, and with the full cost of the delay sitting somewhere permanent in his chest, that certain things must be earned in the forward direction. The door closed softly behind him. Inside, from the back room, Arthur woke, and called out in the uncomplicated and luminous way of children who have been consistently answered, for his mother. The end. "Thank you for walking this road with Amy and Joseph." What began in a rain-swept nursery with 7 cruel words grew into something I hope felt true. A story not merely about a marriage that failed, but about a woman who refused to fail alongside it. Amy's quiet courage, her patient architecture of survival, her refusal to become bitter when she had every right to be. I hope she stayed with you long after the final page, and perhaps Joseph too, in his imperfect arriving way. If this story moved you, challenged you, or simply kept you turning pages, I would love to know. Leave a comment below, share your thoughts, and if you want to be the first to know when the next chapter of something new begins, like, comment, subscribe, and turn on your post notifications. The next story is already waiting. With gratitude, always.